As a final highlight of our program, I'm very happy to introduce the second keynote speech by Pia Pinger. As we have to leave this room right afterwards because that's going to be the next thing, we actually have to be on time. That's why we are starting quickly now. Actually, I personally have to run to the train station right afterwards, so I will please apologize if I literally then run off afterwards. But for that reason, I'm not going to give a long introduction. Most of you will have seen at least some of Pia's work. Pia did her master's in Maastricht, did her PhD in Mannheim, was an assistant professor in Bonn, and now is professor in Cologne, and works on all sorts of areas in education, in human capital, in inequality mostly. Often, I think it's true to say, with some sort of behavioral perspective and different measures in terms of areas that we traditionally haven't looked too much on, so this is always very innovative. And recently, she's been involved with a stream of papers evaluating a mentoring program, which I think is what she's going to talk to us about today, so I don't have to introduce that. I'm just going to give over to you, Pia, so we have enough time to have pleasure to listening to you, and the floor is all yours. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks, Ludger. Thanks for inviting me. I thought this was a really, really nice workshop, not only because it was the first in-person workshop also for me since the past, 1.5 years, but also because I thought we've seen a lot of very innovative and very creative work. And the topic I'm going to talk about now is actually, I think, a nice closure to this workshop. I think it fits very well with the first keynote that I unfortunately missed because of the train breakdown. But it's also going to be about tracking, and it's also, I want to reflect a little bit about the role of the education system also as a sorting device and as a means to either promote or remediate inequality of opportunity. Okay, so we already saw that in Pietro's talk, that I think there's a general notion and a preference of the median voter to say that there's a role of society and of education policy to kind of promote or provide children with equal opportunities, with the possibility to kind of unfold their productive potential before they then, enter this market competition. So during this period of formation, that children are really being given all the opportunities to do well in the education system, to become who they want to become, given their skills and abilities, independent of, maybe what their parents earn or the kind of educational background that parents have. So in a way, educational institutions, ideally, I think, in the people's mind, are there to kind of, foster mobility through kind of pre-distribution before the market competition starts, and also to kind of, cure or work against this accident of birth that nobody can, choose their parental background. Yeah, and this has important implications, I think. So from an economist's point of view, this kind of notion and idea is interesting because it's one of the, I would say, one of the mechanisms where actually very often equity and efficiency concerns are kind of working in the right direction, right? If you promote equality of opportunity in an education system, then you're increasing equity and you're potentially also increasing efficiency if you help people, especially maybe at the lower end of the socioeconomic status distribution of parental background, to kind of unfold productive potential. And I think it's also important because of fairness perceptions and this idea that children can have a better life later than oneself, and that there's a mobility and the possibility to move in society. However, so I think one of the roles for education economists and educational scientists who are interested in inequality is to think about, the education system also as an equality generating or equality of opportunity generating kind of system. And what my talk is now going to be about is also about tracking, but instead of, having like a big international perspective, I'm going to kind of zoom in onto the tracking decision, and I'm going to look at tracking of students from different parental backgrounds. And then I also want to show you how kind of this decision-making process works and how it can be changed or remediated or improved through mentoring, so through getting children from lower socioeconomic status backgrounds into contact with mentors from higher, very educated kind of backgrounds. And then I also prepared some, general thoughts on, tracking and equality of opportunity, and my kind of 2 cents of what I think might be, educational reforms that might work to promote equality of opportunity in the longer term. I think I will be really, really quick on literature because we want to finish on time, and I want to talk a lot about results and other things. So there's a lot of concern about, how can we promote equality of opportunity through kind of early childhood interventions, for example, but also more recently, there's, I think, a growing literature at the intersection between education economics and behavioral economics, where, people look at kind of counseling, mentoring, and other kind of ways that might help, especially lower socioeconomic status students to, help them in their decision-making process, help them kind of in their trajectory through the educational systems. So as I said, the paper I want to present results from is on tracking, and this is what I'm interested in here now is between school tracking. So you have these two forms of tracking. So you can either track students within schools. That's what's being mostly done in the US or in Canada. And in many, many, many other countries, there's actually between school tracking, at least at some point in the education system. And we kind of, looked at all kinds of OECD countries, and we found that about 16 out of 36 countries track before the end of compulsory schooling. So that's a very common thing to have children go to different types of schools. And why did so many countries come up with the idea to track students? I think the original idea is that it might be very efficient if we provide education that's just, targeted at the skills and interests of different student groups. However, there's also a very large literature which shows that tracking can also lead to mismatch. So if we don't find, the ideal match between student abilities and interests and a certain type of schooling, then we have mismatch, and this can reinforce inequalities and can actually also reduce average performance. And my reading of this literature is that why does it reduce average performance is that lower ability students actually benefit a lot from being together with higher ability students for a longer period of time in the same education system, while higher ability students don't suffer as much of studying for a longer period of time together with lower ability students. Germany is a very special case in this tracking kind of area because tracking takes place particularly early and educational mobility is particularly low. And these kind of things go pretty much together. So tracking takes place in most parts of the country already after the 4th grade, so after elementary school, when children are about 10 years of age. And We know also, for example, from these PISA studies, but there's also like a yearly OECD report, or biannually, I think, OECD report, Education at a Glance, and there you would always find that Germany is a country where educational outcomes are particularly strongly dependent on the education of the parents. And we also know from a lot of literature that one of the main reasons why we have this low educational mobility is that we have this tracking system. And for the sake of this talk today, I will just make a very easy distinction in tracking. So I will only make a distinction between vocational types of tracks and academic types of tracks. Vocational type of schooling and academic type of schooling, which I think reflects what most countries do more or less. So they provide an educational track that leads up to some kind of university education and another educational track that's more focused on practical skills and that lead up to some kind of apprenticeship training or vocational training. And this is also what we have in Germany. So I will make this distinction between a high track and a low track. And what's also kind of particular in Germany is that we have a system where tracking takes place very early and where the kind of quality differences between schools are very transparent. So we have a high track and a low track, and in the high track, peers are much better, which is, of course, the result from this, selecting children into different types of schools based on their kind of academic qualifications or abilities. But it's also teacher pay differs. So teachers make about 13% more in the high track than in the low track. The amount of instruction differs. So kids who go to the high track, they do not only go there longer, but they also get more hours of instruction every year. The types of subject differs, and very much also then, once you finish, the educational opportunities differ, because if you finish from a low track school, you're more limited in your educational opportunities because the education certificate you obtain there does not allow you to directly enter university education other than the high track educational credential. And what I think is also important is that we know from the literature that especially low socioeconomic status kids, for them, the tracking decision that is being made for them or with them after 4th grade is very predictive for their final school degrees and for life outcomes, because there's, for low SES kids, there's relatively little flexibility later on in the education system, or they don't use the flexibility that's actually inherent in the education system. And we can see that, so whether you have an academic or a vocational kind of education degree, that's predictive of lifetime wages, but it's also predictive of all kinds of other things, and this is just, of course, correlational evidence here. So, for example, if you look at life satisfaction, and you look at, kids who have, or individuals who have obtained a high-track degree or no high-track degree, you can see that they differ in their life satisfaction all across the life cycle. You can also see that they, for example, differ in their subjective health. So as you grow older, you become less satisfied with your own health, but you can see a clear education gradient there as well. Okay, so for the next 2 or 3 slides, I want to talk to you about data that I will use to then, show you some evidence on how the tracking process works and how the decision-making process works and how it depends on the socioeconomic status of the children and on their performance and abilities. So the results I will show you come from a panel of about 700 children that are all born between 2002 and 2004. And it's called the Bonn Intervention Panel or the BRIC Intervention Panel. And it's this panel of children that we have basically more or less ourselves collected data on, and that we have been following now from the age of 7 or 8 of the children when they entered the panel until today, where they're about 17, 18 years of age. And the data contain very nice high-quality measures of the children's background, so their socioeconomic status, but also their IQ, preferences, personalities, beliefs, and the school environment. And what's also nice is that it's combined with the mentoring RCT, so that we also have some exogenous variation in the kind of environment that these children grow up in. Let me talk you through the kind of structure of the data. So here you can see that we have some children in there that are from low socioeconomic status backgrounds, and some children that are in there that are from high socioeconomic status backgrounds. That's a kind of definition that we apply to the data. And what does it mean to be from a low socioeconomic status background in our data, or from a high socioeconomic status background? Well, we define children to come from a low socioeconomic status background if the parents either, or the household income is in the lowest tercile of the German household income distribution, if the parents are low educated, so neither of the parents has a high-track educational certificate, or if the children are from a single-parent family. Okay, so this I told you what low SES and high SES means in our definition. So how the data are structured is we have this group of low SES kids and of high SES kids. And actually the group of low SES kids has two subgroups, a control group and a treatment group. So after a first baseline wave of data collection, part of the low SES children have randomly been allocated to a mentoring program, have spent 1 year with a highly educated mentor. So the mentoring program is being called Baloo and You. I will say a little bit more about that later. There's a highly educated university student who comes to the family for the duration of 1 year, 1 afternoon per week. And then we have, after the mentoring program, we follow these children and their families, as I said, until the age of 17, and we have repeated measures. So this is a panel, and you can follow these 3 groups of kids over time. And that's actually very nice, because given the large number of high-quality measures and good information about the educational trajectories, we can kind of see in our data then how children from high socioeconomic status backgrounds are growing up as compared to children from low socioeconomic status backgrounds, and the extent to which maybe kids who, receive this exogenous kind of push, this mentoring intervention, how they maybe become a little bit more similar to children from high socioeconomic status backgrounds. Okay, let me use these data, and let's look at how the first educational transition looks like. So this transition after 4th grade into either the high track or the low track. And we do that in 2 kinds of ways. So first of all, we are interested in what we call the kind of raw or unconditional gap. So where we just compare, what fraction of high SES kids end up in a high track school and what fraction of low SES kids end up in a high track school, just unconditional on their whatever ability, performance, just, their parental background. However, if you think about this conceptually, then you might see that this kind of maybe gives you a little bit of what you could call, an upper bound of inequality of opportunity. I think sociologists would say this comprises both primary and secondary effects. Yeah, it comprises differences, differences in outcomes then comprise differences in children's abilities and skills and performance, as well as differences, residual differences in their parental background. So what we also do is that we look at the gap conditional on school performance. So that is then, compare two kids who have performed equally well in elementary school in terms of their grades and see how they differ in the transition to a high-track versus low-track school. And maybe this is a bit of a lower bound of inequality of opportunity, because it kind of captures, when we condition on performance in elementary school, this might capture, differences in effort, as well as maybe potentially differences in skills or circumstances, because children from different backgrounds may also have different opportunities to kind of perform well or not so well because they have different learning environments, maybe different parental investments. Okay, so this is the first set of results. As a dependent variable, here we just have high-track attendance, so it's a dummy variable that is 1 if we observe kids in 5th grade in the high track, and that is 0 if we observe kids in 5th grade in the low track. And we regress that in a simple OLS regression using only the control groups, yes, only the high SES control group and the low SES control group in our data. And yeah, we regress that on a high SES dummy. So what you can see from this table here is that 48%, 49% of the low SES kids end up in the high track, and kids from high SES backgrounds are 31 percentage points more likely to be observed in the high track. In our data, in one specific state of Germany, I should have said that. So this is all kids who grow up in one specific region in Cologne or Bonn. And what we do then, as you move from the left to the right, is that we first put in some controls for age and gender, and then we also control for children's elementary school GPA. And what's kind of surprising is that, the difference between high SES and low SES goes down as we're controlling for GPA, but it doesn't really go down as much as you might expect, right? So ideally, if you were to compare two kids who perform equally well in elementary school, you would kind of expect that, they are maybe equally likely to end up in a high-track program. But this is not at all what we see. So even after conditioning on their elementary school performance, we still see this like 22 percentage points difference in the transition probability. So now the question is, do these conditional or unconditional gaps, do they matter? Yeah? Do they have longer run ramifications? Well, first of all, we know from the literature that they probably do, but we can also see what happens as kids become older, because we follow them over time until they are, in these data, about 16 years of age. So when they're in 9th or 10th grade. And if the results that we know from the literature are true, then we should actually see that these gaps increase. Why is that? Because the low SES kids, they stay where they are, but some of the high SES kids in the low track programs will kind of, move to high track programs. And this is exactly what we see. So when now we use the left part of the table is exactly what we've seen before, but the right part of the table is the same 0-1 dummy, are kids in the high track or in the low track, but now they're in 9th or 10th grade. And what you can see is that both the unconditional gap and the conditional gap, they have kind of increased. They have gone up. Okay, so this kind of confirms what we've seen in the literature. And now the question is, what happens when we compare these, control group situation, and now we kind of throw in the kids that, have been randomly assigned to the mentoring program, and then see what happens to these gaps when the mentor come in. So how much of this inequality of opportunity gap in the first educational transition can be kind of remediated through mentoring. Okay, let me tell you a little bit again about the mentoring program. So the program is called Baloo and You. It's from the Jungle Book. All of you know that probably. So the mentor is Baloo, and the kid is Mowgli. And the mentor comes in and takes Mowgli on his shoulders, her shoulders, and kind of shows them the world. So it's not an academically focused program. It's very relationship focused. It's a role model who comes into the family and who, spends time with the child. They do whatever both of them enjoy. And the idea of the program is to kind of, open new horizons, show what kind of opportunities are out there. Maybe also, counsel the child on all kinds of, problems that it might have. But so that could be, the private life of the child, could also be educational opportunities, but it doesn't have like a particular academic focus at all. Okay, but what could happen when the mentor comes into the family? Well, she could kind of, this could be motivating for the child, have this big friend who, is kind of successful also in the education system. So this could kind of help the child to, do better in the educational system. It could also kind of be an informational kind of thing that changes the parents. So the parents learn maybe a little bit about educational opportunities, which might also affect their decision making. Okay, so this is basically what happens when the mentor comes in. So you see this 31 percentage point difference that we've just seen in the descriptive graph. So that's just the raw gap. And then when the mentor comes in, about 1/3 of this gap is being closed. So the kids who participate, who were randomly allocated to the mentoring program, the low SES kids, are now 11 percentage points more likely to end up in a high-track program. So we have control low SES, treatment low SES, control high SES. So now the question is, that was the kind of raw gap. What happens to the performance-adjusted gap? So once we control for GPA in elementary school, and that's the result you see here. So the treatment effect is pretty much unaffected when we control for pre-treatment elementary school GPA, which makes sense because there was no selection into the mentoring program based on grades. But you can see that the kind of, the part of the gap that's being closed, or the part of the conditional gap that's being closed, is of course larger than the part of the unconditional gap, simply because the conditional gap is smaller than the unconditional gap. And now the question is that a good thing for kids in the longer run, right? So I don't think, that there's a will to kind of discriminate children from lower socioeconomic status backgrounds. There's more this idea that, as low SES children, I think, are less often being sent to a high-track program, even if they have like the same ability as some maybe lower performing high SES kids, but there's some kind of fear that, they might not succeed in the higher track, and then they get frustrated, or they might be down-tracked, or they might have to repeat a grade. And we can look at whether that is actually the case for children that have been shifted into the higher education track through the mentoring program. And we don't see that that's the case. So first of all, same kind of gaps I've shown you before. But now the longer term gaps, we saw that the gaps are kind of increasing over time. The treatment effect stays pretty much exactly the same. So from that you can already see that, it doesn't seem to be the case that a lot of the kids that, have been low SES kids that have been shifted into the high track due to the program are, suffering from that in the longer run because treatment effects don't change when we look at longer run outcomes instead of shorter run outcomes. We can also look at, individuals who are first in the high track, what's their probability to be in the low track later on in their educational careers? What's the probability to move from a low track to a high track, and whether there are differences in control and treatment? We don't see that. We also don't see that treated kids are more likely to repeat a grade than kids that are in the control group. So this seemed to be a good thing also in the longer term. We don't see effects on school satisfaction, except, kids who go to the high track, they tend to be happier with their school, but we don't see any differences between treatment and control. We don't see effects on grades. We see a pretty much exact 0 effect on grades in 4th grade, and only small negative effects when we look, for example, at 5th grade grades that are not significant. We can check who's kind of being shifted into the high track through the mentoring program, and I think that's interesting, or it would kind of confirm what we believe would happen is, so here we have, elementary school grades by deciles, and what you can see is that the control high SES group is always more likely to attend a high track program than the control low SES group, independent of grades. But you can also see that the treatment low SES kids, they become more likely to end up in a high SES, in a high track program, especially if they're kind of at the margin in terms of their grades. Yeah, so the treatment effect is kind of higher for kids who are somewhere in the middle of the grade distribution. Okay, so now let me tell you a little bit about how this decision-making process actually works. So how can it be that, control high SES kids are always more likely to end up in a high track program, independent of their grades, than control low SES kids? So how is that possible? So in the part of the country in Germany that we're studying, the decision-making process works as follows. Children receive, there's basically a 2-stage decision-making process. So first, children receive a track recommendation, and that's a pretty, I would say, a strong signal that's being discussed with the parents intensively, and that's also written on the children's grade transcript after the first half of the 4th grade. They receive a grade transcript, and it says what the teacher recommendation is as regards high track or low track schools after grade 4. And the teachers, they don't have very strict rules according to which they are supposed to make this recommendation. Their goal should be to evaluate the children's overall prospective performance. So they have quite some flexibility here. And then in the second stage, the parents decide based on the recommendation, but very importantly, the parents are free to overrule the recommendation in both directions, and the secondary schools, they're not allowed to accept or reject kids based on their elementary school grades or on their recommendation, which seems, I think, probably kind of strange. It's a rule on inclusive teaching that every child should, be allowed to choose any type of education that he or she wants. Okay, so then we can look a little bit on how this decision-making process differs by socioeconomic status and how the mentoring program comes in here. So we could think that the mentor, either changes the children, maybe motivates the children more, such that they receive better recommendations. It could also be that parents make different decisions. And if parents make different decisions, we are more likely to observe them, the kids in a high track, if either the parents choose the high track although they have, received a low recommendation signal, or because they do not choose the low track although the kid has received a high track recommendation, so if they follow a high track recommendation. Okay, let me tell you there are SES differences on both margins, so recommendations differ, parental decision making differs, and we also see treatment effects on both of these margins. We run a little bit into a power problem, especially when we divide by high recommendation and low recommendation, but we can kind of see that something is happening on all of these margins. And in order to understand then, how much of the treatment effect is driven by the recommendation and how much of the treatment effect is being driven by the kind of, parental decision-making conditional on the signal, we came up with some kind of like non-parametric decomposition of the respective probabilities. So what we do is that we decompose here the treatment effect, the relative probability to observe in a kid in a high-track program for treated versus controls into a recommendation effect. So a difference that is mainly a change that is driven by a change in the teacher recommendation, weighted then with the effect of the recommendation on the actual decision, and with the parental decision effect, which is composed of the change that the program induces in the decision making, that is in the probability to choose a high-track program given a high-track recommendation, and in the probability to choose a high-track program given a low recommendation among the parents. And what we see then is that about 1/3 of the effect comes from the recommendation and about 2/3 comes from the change in parental decision making. Okay, I skipped the robustness and scalability considerations that we make in the paper, and now I want to kind of, open up a little bit more on two things. The first thing is, what do I think can we learn from this in terms of, how we can improve equality of opportunity in the long run? So what kind of possibilities are there? And the second thing is, what do we learn in general from the educational literature about how we can generate longer run effects that actually also, change children's trajectories in the longer term? So I think when we think about how to improve equality of opportunity in the long run, we really have, there are two things that one could do with programs or policies. One is that we could think about changes to the kind of home environment, help maybe low SES children, low SES families to kind of, help their kids to, do well in school, to improve on their skill formation process. Or we could kind of foster out-of-home resources or investments, and that's traditionally what's being done in the educational system or in the school system. So we could kind of, change, improve, augment institutions. So this is now two papers that look at reforms to tracking, for example. We could kind of have someone come in through, for example, mentoring or educational interventions. Very often, what I think is, what we learn from the literature is that, changes to the home environment can have very lasting effects if they happen very early, mostly before children enter into the education system. Changes to the policy reforms or educational reforms can be very effective, but the size of the effect kind of depends, and I think it's kind of difficult to reform an education system as a whole in a way that it really makes a big shift to equality of opportunity. Regarding the third thing here, mentoring or educational interventions, so this is more people-focused, people, acting as support, advice. I think this can be very effective, but also here in the literature, we see a lot of mixed evidence. So what do any of these types of policies or things that one can do, how do they have to be characterized to really, do some bang for the buck, and how can we achieve long-run effects? And I think there's a really nice paper that came out in Psychological Science recently. And what this paper says is that, there are 3 things that successful kind of education programs or reforms focus on that promote equality of opportunity. The first thing is that either they change fundamental skills, preferences, or belief in a very lasting kind of manner. So this often happens with these like early education programs. Or the programs set in at a time where institutions offer post-intervention opportunities or constraints. So I think this is something that happened when, in our case, so there's some critical timing, points of time in the education system, especially where critical educational decisions are being made. And it's good to have these kind of programs set in at these points in time, or programs or reforms that lead to a sustainable change in the children's educational environment or learning environment or background environment. In our case with the mentoring program, I think it worked well, although maybe it only had small or 0 effects on the actual skill accumulation, is because the timing was just right. It was before a very critical educational decision. So in that sense, it happened at a time where, the institutional context was such that, it happened just before a critical decision period. So the institutional setting was such that it offered important post-intervention opportunities. And because children then went to a different track, this also led to a sustainable change in the environment. Okay, so let me conclude this, my last slide. So I try to convince you that there are large socioeconomic status differences in tracking due to circumstance in Germany, and that only 1/3 of these socioeconomic status differences that we observe can actually be explained by differences in elementary school performance. We've seen that a mentoring RCT can reduce this inequality of opportunity gap, partly because it changes these recommendations that the kids get, partly because it changes parental decision making, and that such, an intervention which kind of shifted some low SES kids into a high track program had, lasting positive effects for these children, so that we didn't see any of the positive effects of attending a high track program backfire. And I also try to convince you that timing to close to critical transitions can be important, and that this is maybe something that we should keep in mind when we look at reforms or programs, that especially these critical educational decision points are very important, because small changes can lead to, a lasting change in educational trajectories. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Pia, for this nice, stimulating, important talk. We've got time for a couple of questions if we want. Herman, do we have?
Thank you. Very interesting talk.
The microphone.
Thank you. Yes. So thank you. A very interesting talk and very optimistic about the effects of mentoring. In the Netherlands, there's a lot of debate going on about another intervention, which is called high-dosage tutoring, which is extremely effective but also very expensive. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the mentoring program as you have studied it. Is it also very costly? Is it really one-to-one? In that sense, just as costly as it could be for this high-dosage tutoring? It doesn't really matter if the mentor helps them to make homework, or goes to the home family and discuss, the things you described. So can you tell us a bit more about the effectiveness on the content of the mentoring program, not only in terms of role models, but maybe also in terms of academic assistance, because that could also happen, I guess, in those homes.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, the mentors, they're all volunteers. So in that sense, the program is cheap, but it depends, of course, on this, set of volunteers that you cannot maybe not extend infinitely. So the cost of the program is about 1,000 euros per year per child. It's very important we see that the mentors are volunteers, so we can we know a little bit about their motivations to take part in the program, depending on whether they get credit for that for their university studies or not. And we can see the more they volunteer because they want to help kids, the better they are as mentors, the more effective they are as mentors. So I think this is something that's really important to keep in mind in terms of, scalability. And I think also what you have in mind in academic mentoring. What they do with the kids, we have diaries where they write down what they did with the kid every week. And it's actually very little is focused on homework. So I don't know the exact number, but I would say maybe 10% of the time is spent on homework-related stuff. So it's most is really just playing and enjoying time together. Yeah.
Larissa, maybe the final short question.
Thank you so much. Did you also control not only for GPA, but also for IQ and the non-cognitive skills, and how did that change this lower bound?
Yeah, so this is something we discussed at length when we worked on this project, because actually we do have fluid intelligence measures, crystallized intelligence measures. We have a big battery on children's comportment at home. We also have really good measures about, for example, children's risk aversion, patience, prosociality, and so on and so forth. And in the end, we decided to only condition on grades, because this is the transparent kind of signal that children and teachers get and that they know about. But of course, you can also, control for other kinds of things, and you can even, take this to the extreme and see, let's throw in all the information we have in our data and see what happens then. And you can make this kind of gap go down more, but not if after you condition on grades, the IQ scores and all the other stuff doesn't do that very much anymore. Yeah.
Jacqueline, final question.
Final question. Yeah, thank you for this good presentation. I have one question about to follow the teacher recommendation. You implemented this intervention in North Rhine-Westphalia. Okay. What is you have to follow the teacher recommendation like in Bayern or Hessen? That's some kind, because the intervention has no effect on the grades.
Yeah. So you're completely right. So we know from the literature that when the teacher recommendation is binding, that in general this tends to reduce SES gaps, which kind of makes sense given also our results, because we see that a lot of the gap actually comes from high SES parents sending their kids to high SES academic programs, no matter what the teacher tells them, and low SES parents kind of, following the recommendation and, adhering to it. So I guess the intervention effects would be smaller, because they would be mostly only, be driven by the teacher recommendation, and not by this parental decision-making effect. So in that sense, you're right, but maybe the gap in the first place would also be smaller. So it's hard to tell, but the game would be different, for sure, yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Pia, for this great keynote. Let's give it a round of applause.